Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Let the day go now. Let it slip off your shoulders like a coat you no longer need to wear. You've carried it long enough, and here, in this quiet place, there is nothing more you have to hold. The lamp is low, the blankets are warm. Outside, the water moves the way water always moves at night, slow and patient, and in no hurry at all. And somewhere far off a bell rings once against a buoy, and then is quiet again. You are safe. You are still. And all you have to do for the next long while is breathe, and listen, and let a story carry you gently down into sleep. Tonight the story is about a man who painted the stars. But before he ever touched a brush, before there were sunflowers or wheat fields or a sky that seemed to turn slowly in the dark like something alive, there was only a small boy walking down a quiet Dutch road past a small stone church in a place called Groot Zundert. And I want to begin there, softly, in the flat green country of the southern Netherlands, in the province of North Brabant, where the fields run to the horizon and the sky is enormous and low, and the wind moves through the grass like a hand smoothing a bedsheet. He was born on the 30th of March in the year 1853. Vincent Willem van Gogh. Say the name gently to yourself and let it settle. Vincent. It's an old name, a good name, and it belonged to him, and yet, in a strange way, it had belonged to someone else first, because there was a headstone, a small grave in the churchyard at Groot Zundert, near the church where his father preached, and carved into that stone was a name and a date. The name was Vincent Willem van Gogh, and the date was the 30th of March, 1852. 1 year to the very day before he was born. His parents had lost a son before him, a first child, stillborn, who never opened his eyes on the world, and they had given that child a name, Vincent Willem, and they had buried him beneath that small stone in the churchyard. And then, exactly 1 year later, on the same date on the calendar, another son came, living this time, breathing this time, and they gave him the very same name, Vincent Willem van Gogh, so that the boy who lived grew up in a small parsonage in a small village, and every Sunday, and on all the ordinary days in between, he could walk out past that churchyard and see, carved in stone, his own name and his own birthday on a grave that was there before he ever was. Imagine that, quietly, without any fear in it, just the strange, soft weight of it. A little boy with dark red hair and pale eyes, standing at the edge of a churchyard in the long Dutch afternoon, reading the letters of his own name in the grey stone, letters worn a little smoother by rain, and not quite understanding, the way children never quite understand these things, what it meant to be the second one to carry a name. What it meant to arrive in a place where you had, in some sense, already been. We don't know what he thought. He never really told us, not clearly. But it is a true thing, a real thing, one of the first real things about his life, and people have wondered about it ever since, whether some part of him always felt like a visitor in his own life, a boy standing in for someone else, filling a shape that had been made before he came. We can only wonder. Tonight we'll just let it be what it is, a small stone, a shared name, a quiet beginning. And we'll walk on. His father was Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant pastor, a minister of the church, a serious and gentle and rather unbending man who preached in that small village and moved from parish to parish as ministers did, carrying his family with him. Theodorus was not a rich man. A country pastor's living was a modest one, respectable but never comfortable, and he wore his black coat and his high collar and did his duty and expected his children to do theirs. He was kind, in his careful way. But he was a man who believed deeply in order, in propriety, in the quiet, correct path through life. And his eldest living son would turn out to be a boy, and then a man, who could not walk a quiet, correct path to save his life. That difficulty was still years away, though, for now the father simply loved the boy and worried about him a little, the way fathers do. And his mother was Anna Cornelia Carbentus. She came from The Hague, from a family a little grander than her husband's, and she had something in her that would matter enormously later, though no one could have known it then. She loved nature. She loved the fields and the flowers and the changing weather and the birds, and she drew. She was an amateur draughtswoman, which only means that she made drawings for the love of making them, watercolours of plants and flowers, careful little studies of the natural world, done at the kitchen table in the long evenings for no reason but pleasure. She taught her children to look. To really look at a leaf, at the veins in it, at the way the light came through it. To notice the world instead of merely passing through it. And of all her children, one boy took that lesson so far into himself that it would burn there for the rest of his short life. He learned from his mother at a kitchen table in a Dutch village how to look, and looking, in the end, would be the whole of what he did. So that was the beginning. A parsonage, a pastor-father, black-coated and grave, a mother with a pencil and a love of flowers, a churchyard with a small stone in it, a wide, flat green country under an enormous sky, and a boy with red hair and a name that had been used once before. Now, here is the strange and beautiful and heartbreaking thing about the man that boy became, and I want to say it slowly, because everything else in the story rests on it, and because it is the reason we are telling the story at all. In his whole life, and it would not be a long life, Vincent van Gogh made nearly 2,000 works of art. Almost 2,000, around 860 paintings in oil, thick with colour, and something like 1,300 more drawings and watercolours and sketches. 2,000 pieces of work made by two hands in one lifetime, and he made almost all of them in the space of a single decade. 10 years. 10 years of work so relentless, so feverish, so entirely poured out, that it is hard to fully take in. He would paint a canvas, and then another, sometimes a painting in a single day, as though he were racing something only he could see. And in all that time, through all those hundreds of paintings, through all that colour and light and labour, he sold, as far as anyone can say for certain, almost nothing. Not almost nothing in the way we might loosely say it, almost nothing in the truest, hardest sense. For year after year after year, canvas after canvas, no one wanted them. No buyer came. No gallery filled with people willing to pay. He lived, for essentially his entire career as an artist, on money sent to him by his younger brother. We'll come to that brother, and he is the warm centre of this whole story, so hold the thought of him gently as we go, and he made painting after painting that leaned against the walls of rented rooms, stacked and unsold, gathering the ordinary dust of a life that the world had not yet noticed and did not seem to want to. And then, at 37 years old, an age that is barely past the middle of a young life, an age at which most people are only beginning to find their footing, he died. He died believing, with a quiet and settled certainty, that he had failed, that his life's work had come to nothing, that he had been a burden, a disappointment, a man who tried and could not make it come right. He did not know, he could not possibly have known, that within a few short decades his name would be spoken with reverence in every corner of the earth, that his paintings would hang behind glass in the great museums of the world, guarded, insured, treasured beyond almost any other paintings ever made. That a single one of the canvases stacked unsold against his wall would one day change hands for a sum of money so large it would have seemed to him like a figure from a fairy tale, tens of millions of dollars for one picture. He did not know any of it. He died in the dark, so to speak, believing the whole thing had been for nothing. That is the story. That is the ache at the heart of it. A man who gave everything and was told by silence that everything was not enough. And tonight, slowly, gently, we are going to walk the whole of it, not to be sad, but because there is something in this story that is finally, quietly, redemptive, because he was wrong. He had not failed. He simply died before the world caught up to him, and two people who loved him would make certain, in the years after he was gone, that the world caught up at last. But that comes later. For now, we go back to the boy, and to the long, strange, stumbling road he walked before he ever became a painter at all. Because here is something most people don't know about Vincent van Gogh, and it is one of the most human and comforting things in his whole story. For most of his life, he was a failure at everything he tried. Not a tortured genius striding toward his destiny, just a young man who kept trying things and kept not succeeding at them. Job after job, path after path. Each one begun with intensity, each one ending in disappointment. If you have ever felt that you were behind in your own life, that everyone else seemed to have found their way while you were still lost, that you had begun again and again and kept ending up nowhere, then Vincent van Gogh is, in a strange way, a companion to you. Because for years and years, that was exactly who he was. It started, as these things often do, with a family connection and a respectable position. When Vincent was 16 years old, in the year 1869, he went to work for a firm called Goupil and Company. Goupil was a large and successful art dealership, a business that bought and sold paintings and, more importantly, sold reproductions, prints, engravings, copies of famous works, to the growing middle classes of Europe who wanted a little beauty on their walls. It was a good firm, an international firm, and Vincent had an uncle in the trade, so a place was found for the boy. He began at the branch in The Hague, that same city his mother had come from, learning the business of art from the selling side, handling prints and paintings, learning their names and their values, wrapping them, showing them to customers, keeping the ledgers. And here is the surprise. At first, he was good at it. This restless young man, who would later fail at so much, was, in the beginning, a competent and even promising employee. He knew a great deal about art. He had grown up looking, remember, at his mother's knee. He could talk about pictures with real feeling and real knowledge. He was quiet and hard-working and serious, and the firm thought well of him. So well that after a few years they promoted him and sent him abroad. They sent him to their branch in London. Picture him there, a young man, perhaps 20 years old, arriving in the enormous grey roar of London in the 1870s, the greatest city in the world at the time, the capital of an empire. All fog and coal smoke and horse-drawn traffic and the endless crowds. He took lodgings. He walked to work each day past the shop windows and the street sellers. He was doing well. He was earning a decent wage, more at that time than his own father, the pastor, earned, and the future seemed to be quietly opening in front of him. He might have become, in another version of his life, a respectable art dealer, prosperous and settled, growing older behind the counter of a gallery, and no one would ever have heard his name. That was the path he was on. And it was a good path. And then he fell in love. And the whole quiet, respectable path began to come apart. In his London lodgings there was a landlady, a widow named Ursula Lawyer, and the landlady had a daughter, a young woman named Eugenie Lawyer. And Vincent, in the way of intense and lonely young men, fell for her completely, secretly, entirely. He built a whole future in his mind. He imagined a life with her. He carried the feeling around inside himself for a long time, quietly, the way he carried most of his deepest feelings, not saying it aloud, letting it grow and grow. And then at last he spoke. He told her how he felt. He offered her his heart, all of it, in the total and unguarded way he did everything. And she said no. She was, it turned out, already engaged to someone else, a previous lodger in fact, and had never thought of Vincent in that way at all. His great secret love had been, from her side, nothing, a polite young tenant she barely noticed. The refusal landed on him with tremendous force. It is often said that this rejection, this first breaking of his heart, was the beginning of the change in him. The beginning of the withdrawal, the turning inward, the growing strangeness that would slowly cost him his place in ordinary life. That may be too neat an explanation. A life is never undone by a single thing. But something did shift in him around this time. He grew quiet. He grew fervent. He turned with more and more intensity toward religion. And that turn, that deepening religious fervour, was the thing that finished his career at Goupil. Because a young man selling art to comfortable middle-class customers is supposed to be pleasant, agreeable, obliging, and Vincent was becoming none of those things. He began to find the whole business of selling pictures distasteful, even offensive, treating art, this sacred thing, as mere merchandise, mere decoration for people who did not truly feel it. He said as much to the customers. He grew short with them, argued with them, told them plainly what he thought of their taste. You can imagine how that went over. A salesman who scolds the buyers does not last long. The firm moved him back to Paris, hoping a change would settle him, and it didn't. He grew worse, more absent, more absorbed in his Bible and his brooding. And finally, in the year 1876, when he was 23 years old, Goupil and Company let him go. He was dismissed. The good path, the respectable path, the path that might have made him comfortable and unknown, it closed behind him, and he stepped off it, and he would never find anything like it again. So what does a young man do when he has lost his profession and turned his whole soul toward God? He tries to serve God. And Vincent tried with all the burning sincerity that was in him. But here too, the road was only failure. One failure after another, each one begun in hope and ending in disappointment. And I want to walk through them slowly, because there is something almost tender in how hard he tried and how nothing worked. First, he went back to England to try his hand at teaching. He took a position at a small school in the seaside town of Ramsgate on the Kent coast, working as an assistant teacher for a schoolmaster, teaching young boys, for very little money in fact at first, for no money at all, only room and board. Imagine him walking those windy English streets by the grey sea, a tall, awkward foreigner with red hair and a heavy Dutch accent and eyes that were always a little too intense, trying to keep order among a room of restless boys. Then the school moved to a place called Isleworth on the edge of London, and he moved with it, and there he began to blend his teaching with his religion. For by now the pull of the church had grown almost total. He wanted to preach. He wanted to bring comfort to the poor. He began to assist a Methodist minister, and at last he gave his first sermon, standing up before a small congregation and speaking about faith and about the road of life, and he wrote to his brother afterward, glowing, saying that when he stood in the pulpit, he felt like a man coming up out of a dark underground cave into the friendly daylight. He wanted to be a preacher. He wanted it with everything in him. But wanting a thing with everything in you is not the same as being able to do it, and the door to the ministry, it turned out, was hard, and it did not open easily for him. So he came home to the Netherlands, tried yet another thing, and failed at that too. He took a position as a clerk in a bookshop in the town of Dordrecht. A bookshop clerk, quiet work, orderly work, surrounded by the printed word he loved. But he was no good at it. His mind was not on the ledgers and the customers. He spent his hours when he should have been working, translating passages of the Bible into different languages, filling the margins of his account books with drawings and religious sketches, staring out the window, lost in the great burning question of what he was supposed to do with his life. He did not last long there either. And then he made the biggest attempt of all. He decided he would become a proper minister, an ordained pastor like his father, and to do that he would have to study theology at the university. So he went to Amsterdam to live with an uncle, and he threw himself into study with that same total, exhausting intensity he brought to everything. But to enter the university and study theology, he first had to pass a great battery of entrance examinations: Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, the whole formidable apparatus of 19th century classical education. And Vincent, who had left ordinary schooling behind years before, now in his mid-20s, had to sit down and learn Latin verbs and Greek grammar and algebra from the beginning, cramming them into a mind that was already so full of feeling and longing that there was hardly room. He hired a tutor. He worked at it desperately for months. He wrote of punishing himself, of studying until he could not think, of the whole thing feeling like a mountain he could not climb. And he could not climb it. The languages would not stay in his head. The mathematics defeated him. After more than a year of this grinding, painful effort, he gave it up. He abandoned the examinations. He would never become an ordained minister. Another door had opened before him, and he had walked toward it with everything he had, and it had closed in his face. Let us just sit with that for a moment, gently, in the warmth of this quiet place, because there is comfort in it. Strange as that sounds. Here was a young man now well into his 20s who had failed at being an art dealer, failed at being a teacher, failed at being a bookshop clerk, failed at becoming a preacher, failed at the university. Every serious path he had tried to walk had ended in a wall. From the outside, to his family, to the neighbours, to anyone keeping a ledger of his life. He must have looked like a lost cause, a bright, strange, difficult young man who could not seem to make anything of himself, who was always beginning and never arriving, who worried his careful pastor father and his gentle mother, who cost the family money and standing and peace of mind, and who gave back, so far, nothing but disappointment. Nearly 30 years old, and nothing to show for it. No profession, no wife, no settled place in the world, just a trail of good intentions and closed doors. If you have ever lain awake feeling like that, like the years were slipping by, and you had not yet found the thing you were for, then you know exactly the country he was living in. And here is the quiet, extraordinary secret that the sleeping world does not always tell us. He was, at that very moment, closer than he had ever been to the one thing he was truly made for. All those failures were not the end of his story. They were the long, dark hallway that led to the only door that would ever open for him. He just could not see it yet. No one could. He did not know, this failed young man walking the Dutch roads with empty hands, that within a few short years he would pick up a pencil and then a brush and begin to make marks that the whole world would one day travel across oceans to stand in front of. He did not know that the looking his mother had taught him at the kitchen table, the veins in the leaf, the light through the petal, had been quietly preparing him the entire time, through every failure, for the one work that would need it. He did not know that the very intensity that had made him a bad salesman and a difficult clerk and an impossible student, that overwhelming, total, all-or-nothing way he had of pouring himself into things, was not a flaw to be corrected, but the exact fuel that a great artist would need. He did not know any of it. He only knew that he had failed again. And he was tired, and he did not know what he was for. But before the brush, before the colour, before Paris and Arles and the stars, there was one more failure still to come. The deepest and the strangest of them all. The one that would break him completely and, in the breaking, finally clear the ground for what he was meant to do. It would happen far from the tidy Dutch parsonages of his childhood, in a black and sooty landscape of coal and poverty among the poorest people he had ever met. And it is there, in that grim place, at the very bottom of his long fall, that our story will go next. But not tonight. Not right now. Right now there is nothing you need to do but rest. The young man is walking home along the flat road under the enormous Dutch sky, and the light is going soft and gold at the edges, and there is no hurry, and there is no failure that cannot in time become the ground that something beautiful grows out of. You are safe here. The water is moving slowly outside, the way it always does. The lamp is low. Let your thoughts drift the way that gold light drifts along the tops of the fields. Let the story hold you. There is so much more of it, and it is all here waiting, and none of it will go anywhere while you rest. Breathe in, slowly, and let it go, and we will walk on together into the dark coal country, and toward the moment a failed young man of 27, with nothing left to lose, at the very bottom of everything, picks up a pencil and begins, at last, to draw. The Borinage is not a place that appears in many paintings. There is a reason for that. It sits in the south of Belgium, not far from the French border. And in 1879 it was a country of soot. The mines went down deep beneath the flat fields, and the men who worked them came up black at the end of every shift, their faces carved with coal dust that no amount of washing ever fully removed. The houses were cramped and damp. The children were thin. The air above the pits tasted of sulphur. And in winter the cold came in through the walls of the cottages with the easy, indifferent confidence of something that has never been stopped. It was not a place people chose, it was a place people were born into and stayed in, because leaving required resources they did not have. Vincent van Gogh arrived there in January 1879 as a lay evangelist, sent by a provisional church committee to minister to the mining community of Wasmes. He was 25 years old. He had failed at selling art, failed at teaching, failed at working in a bookshop, failed at theology school in Amsterdam. He had been tested, been found wanting, and had each time gathered himself up and tried something different, driven by this restless, consuming need to be of use, to matter, somehow, to somebody. The church offered him what seemed like a chance at that. The miners were poor and suffering, and Vincent felt with absolute conviction that he was supposed to help them. The committee gave him a modest allowance and a set of expectations that were, in their way, quite conventional. He was to visit the sick, hold Bible readings, give comfort. He was to be, in other words, a gentle and presentable presence among people who needed gentle and presentable presences. What the committee had not anticipated, what perhaps nobody who had known Vincent could have anticipated, was the depth and literalness of his response to what he found there. He went down into the mines. He visited the men at the coalface and watched them work in the dark, hundreds of feet below the surface, in tunnels so narrow that a grown man had to fold himself in half to move through them. He went to the cottages and sat with the sick and the injured. He saw what real poverty looked like. Not the respectable poverty of a pastor's household, where things were tight, but there was always a roof and a meal, but the other kind, the kind with no floor beneath it, where a single accident or illness could take the last thing a family had. And something happened to Vincent in the face of that. He couldn't hold back. He couldn't be comfortable while the people around him were suffering. He gave away his bed and slept on a bundle of straw on the floor. He tore up his own shirts to use as bandages for injured miners. He ate almost nothing, keeping the money that was meant for his food and giving it to families who had less. He moved out of his relatively adequate lodgings and into a small, dilapidated hut, the kind of shelter that barely kept the weather out because it seemed wrong to him to live better than the people he was among. He was, by every account, completely sincere. There was no performance in it, no seeking of admiration. He simply could not stand the gap between his comfort and their suffering, and he kept trying to close it. The church committee visited. They saw what he had made of himself, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, wearing filthy clothes, living in a hut, and they were appalled. This was not what a representative of the church was supposed to look like. It reflected badly on the institution. A man of God was meant to inspire respect, not merge himself with the desperate. They reviewed his position and, in the summer of 1879, they dismissed him. The reason they gave, with an almost unbearable irony, was excess of zeal. He cared too much. He gave too much. He took the call to love his neighbour too literally, and it made them uncomfortable, and so they let him go. He was left then with nothing. No position, no income, no direction, and no clear sense of what to try next. He wandered the Borinage for some months in a state that his letters describe with painful clarity, a kind of grey, inward collapse, not quite despair, but the condition just beside it, where a person is too tired even to despair properly. He walked enormous distances, sometimes 15 or 20 miles in a day, through the flat black countryside. He visited the studio of the painter Jules Breton in the village of Couriers, having walked there from the Borinage, a journey of several days, because Breton was a painter he admired, and he thought perhaps he could speak to him, and perhaps that would help. He arrived at the studio, looked at the forbidding bourgeois house, and turned around and walked away without knocking. He slept in haystacks, he drew a little in sketchbooks, the miners, the women bent over their washing, the dark landscape with its headframes and spoil heaps. But he did not think of himself as an artist. Not yet. Then, somewhere in the long grey stretch of 1880, something shifted. It is hard to say exactly when. The letters from that period are sparse and sometimes anguished. But at some point in that year, he was 27, Vincent made a decision that was not like the other decisions he had made. the ones pulled toward him by obligation or expectation or the desire to please his father. This one came from somewhere deeper. He decided he was going to be a painter, not because it was sensible, or because anyone encouraged him, or because he had any training or any realistic prospect of success. He decided because, looking at his own history, at all the things he had tried and failed at, the only moments that had ever felt true were the moments when he was making pictures, the little sketches, the compulsive drawings in the margins of his letters, the hours spent copying the anatomical studies and the prints he loved. Everything else had been an attempt to fit himself into a shape that did not fit. This was the shape. He wrote to Theo. He asked for money, for drawing materials, for the illustrated magazines with the wood engravings he wanted to copy. And Theo, who was then working as an art dealer in Paris at the firm that had grown out of Goupil, sent what he could. Not much at first, but something. Enough to begin. And so Vincent began. He started, as all beginners must, with the fundamentals. He copied. He drew figure after figure from the Manual of Anatomy by the artist Charles Bargue, working through the exercises with a patience and a methodical stubbornness that nobody who had known him as a restless young art salesman would necessarily have predicted. He drew from plaster casts. He drew the farm labourers in the fields around the Borinage, the women with their heavy baskets, the men bent over their spades. He filled sketchbooks, he threw them away and started again. He was teaching himself from scratch, and he knew it, and it didn't discourage him, or rather the discouragement came and he pushed through it, because he had found the thing, finally, the one thing, and he was not going to let go of it now. He moved back to the Netherlands. There were stays in Etten, in the parsonage of his parents, where he drew the landscape around the village, the road through the poplars, the ditches, the flat horizon that holds so much grey Dutch sky. He went to The Hague, where his cousin by marriage, the painter Anton Mauve, gave him some instruction and his first box of oil paints, a gesture of generosity that Vincent received with overwhelming gratitude. He began working in oils, awkwardly at first, the paint heavy and clumsy and dark. He drew constantly, working through the problems of perspective and proportion with books and with practice, sending the drawings to Theo for criticism and encouragement, asking always whether they were getting better, whether there was something in them. The years from 1880 to 1885 are the years of the dark palette. The canvases from this period are heavy things, painted in browns and blacks and muddy greens, the colours of the Dutch landscape in autumn, the colours of coal dust and candlelight. There is nothing cheerful about them. They are not meant to be. Vincent was painting the world he knew and the people who lived closest to the earth, the weavers at their looms, the peasants in their gardens, the old men sitting by the fire. He was interested in work, in hands, in the weight of lives lived close to necessity. He copied the drawings of Jean-François Millet, the French painter of rural labour, with a reverence that bordered on devotion. Millet had made the dignity of peasant life visible, had found something sacred in a figure bent over a row of potatoes, and Vincent wanted to do the same thing. In 1885, he produced what he considered his first serious statement, a painting he called The Potato Eaters. He worked on it through the spring in the village of Nieuwenan, where his parents were now living, and he laboured over it with unusual deliberateness, making studies, drawing the individual figures, reworking the composition again and again. The painting shows 5 peasants gathered around a table in a dim cottage, eating from a shared dish of potatoes by the light of a single overhead lamp. Their hands are rough. Their faces are weathered and particular and plain. The light is the colour of old wood, of the inside of a barn, of every interior that has never seen the sun. The potatoes on the dish are the same colour as the hands that take them, the hands that dug them from the earth. He wrote to Theo about it with unusual care. He wanted people to understand that these hands had worked, that the people in the picture had earned their food honestly, with their own bodies, in the way he had seen in the Borinage and in the fields around Nuenen. He was not painting prettiness, he was painting the truth of a kind of life, and he wanted the darkness to be right, to feel right, to carry the weight of it. He was 22 when he had first gone to the Borinage. He was 32 when he finished The Potato Eaters. 10 years of failure and wandering had gone into the making of that painting. Though you could not see them in it directly, you could only feel them in the conviction with which the paint was laid down, in the absolute seriousness of the figures, in the sense that whoever painted this had spent real time with real people and had not looked away. He was learning, slowly, stubbornly, with enormous effort and very little outward reward. There were other things happening in those years, things that had nothing to do with painting and everything to do with the kind of person Vincent was, the person who could not moderate himself, could not protect himself, could not stop caring about people with a ferocity that regularly frightened them away. He fell in love, repeatedly and disastrously. This was not incidental. His romantic life and his working life were made of the same material, the same absolute sincerity, the same inability to pretend, the same conviction that if you felt something strongly enough, the other person must eventually feel it too. There was Kivos Stricker. She was his cousin, widowed with a young child, and in 1881 Vincent fell for her with the completeness and the blindness that characterized everything he did. He was staying with his parents in Eton when it happened, and Key was visiting. He told her how he felt. She said no. She said it plainly, firmly, in words that left no ambiguity. No, never, never. 3 words. He did not hear them. He continued to pursue her, wrote letters, showed up at her father's house in Amsterdam. Her family, exhausted and alarmed, arranged things so she was simply not present when he arrived. Her father held a lamp over the flame and said, "Your love is as impossible as holding your hand in this flame." Vincent held his hand in the flame. He was not performing anything. He meant it. The love was not accepted. The love did not diminish. He eventually, painfully, understood that it was over, and he carried the wound of it in the way he carried all wounds, not quietly put away in a drawer, but present, acknowledged, turned over and over in letters to Theo, with an almost archaeological patience. After Key there was Sienne. Her full name was Klasina Maria Hornick, and she was a woman who had been dealt a very different hand. Vincent met her in The Hague in 1882, in the street. She was a seamstress and at times a prostitute. She was pregnant. She had a young daughter. She had had smallpox and her face bore its marks. By any measure of conventional Dutch respectability, she was exactly the wrong woman for the son of a Protestant pastor to take up with. Vincent moved her into his studio and looked after her through her pregnancy. When the baby was born, he was in the hospital room. He made drawings of her nursing the child, of her sitting by the window in that characteristic posture of exhausted, provisional peace that women who have survived difficult lives often carry in their bodies. He called her Sienne. He wrote to Theo that she had given him something he had never had, a home, a household, the feeling of being needed by someone who needed him back. It lasted a little under 2 years. The practical difficulties were enormous. His family's disapproval, Theo's concern, the insufficient money, the impossibility of the situation as a sustained life. And Sienne herself, ground down by poverty and probably by Vincent's own intensity, eventually drifted away from the arrangement, back toward the world she knew. He let her go. He was not bitter about it, or at least the bitterness, if it was there, did not dominate the letters. He was sad, the way a person is sad when something they hoped might work turns out not to be able to. Genuinely sad, without drama, the way rain is wet. And there was Margot Begerman. This was in Nieuwenan, while his parents were there, while he was painting the weavers and the potato eaters. She was a neighbour, older than Vincent by some years, not young, living quietly next door. They spent time together, walking in the fields, and she fell in love with him. He seems to have cared for her genuinely, perhaps more gently than the earlier loves, perhaps because she was the one doing the falling, and he was, for once, in the position of receiving something rather than pursuing it. He told her family he would marry her. Her family objected. Margot Begerman, in despair, swallowed a quantity of strychnine. She survived. Vincent got her to a doctor in time. She recovered. The relationship did not. He mentioned these things in his letters in the same breath as the paintings, the same careful, undefended honesty. He was not ashamed. He did not present them as scandals or as proof of his unworthiness. They were simply what had happened, part of the texture of a life that refused to arrange itself neatly. He was, in this as in everything, constitutionally incapable of keeping anything at arm's length. He went all the way in, every time, and every time the world pulled back, and he was left standing in the open, empty-handed, more or less exactly where he'd been before, with another drawing to make. It is worth pausing here for a moment, in the slow dark of these early years, to sit with something that can seem almost incomprehensible from where we now stand. Vincent van Gogh, in those years in Nieuwenan and The Hague and the Belgian countryside, was not recognized. He was not admired. He was not selling anything. He was, in the view of almost everyone around him, a troubled making member of a respectable family who had failed at every normal profession and was now devoting himself to gloomy pictures of peasants and coal miners that nobody wanted. His father was worried about him. The women he loved left him or turned him away. He lived on the money Theo sent, and Theo sent it every month with extraordinary faithfulness, but even Theo was sometimes uncertain, sometimes gentle in his questions about whether Vincent was making progress, whether the paintings were getting better. Vincent sent the work, and Theo took it in, and the world outside that small circuit of two brothers did not notice. He knew this. He was not deluded about it. He read it clearly, the way a person reads the weather, not with surprise, but with a kind of steady, almost stoic acknowledgement. He was bad at many things. He knew that. He was getting less bad at drawing. That was something. He was going to keep going until he was better. That was the only plan he had. And then, in late 1885, he left the Netherlands. His father, Theodorus, had died that spring, suddenly, a stroke, in the doorway of the parsonage, and Vincent's relationship with the rest of the family was difficult and strained. He went first to Antwerp, where he enrolled briefly and unhappily at the academy, where the instructors found his work crude and put him back in the beginner's class, which was perhaps accurate but not particularly useful to a 32-year-old man who had been painting for 5 years and had his own quite definite ideas about what he was doing. He left Antwerp. He went to Paris. He arrived in Paris in March 1886. Theo was living there, working at the gallery that had grown from Goupil, and Vincent moved in with him, and that, is where everything changed. You have to imagine what it must have been like for a man who had spent 6 years teaching himself to paint in a very specific style, dark, earthbound, northern, serious, owing most of its debts to the Dutch masters of the 17th century and to Millet, to step suddenly into Paris in 1886. He was in the middle of Impressionism. The movement was already well established. Monet and Renoir and Degas had been painting their bright, light-saturated canvases for over a decade, but its energy was still alive, still changing things, still arguing with the old hierarchies about what a painting was and what it was supposed to do. And beyond Impressionism there were the post-Impressionists, the neo-Impressionists, the pointillists. Paul Signac putting colours down in individual dots of pure hue so that the eye would mix them at a distance, producing a luminosity that no blended pigment could match. And beyond all of that, there were the Japanese woodblock prints, Hiroshige and Hokusai, flooding into Paris in those years, changing the way Western painters thought about colour and outline and the flatness of a picture plane. Vincent walked into all of this at 33 and let it rearrange him. It did not happen overnight. Nothing with Vincent happened overnight. But over the 2 years he lived in Paris, a crowded, difficult 2 years for Theo, whose small apartment had to absorb not only his brother's physical presence, but the enormous, restless, sometimes overwhelming presence of Vincent's personality. The dark palette dissolved. He started painting with bright colour, with yellow and orange and cobalt blue, with the particular luminous green of spring trees seen against a pale sky. He made studies of Japanese prints in oils, copying the flat blocks of colour. He painted the view from Theo's apartment window, the rooftops and chimneys of Montmartre, and they glowed with a warmth the Nuenen canvases had never possessed. He painted self-portraits with a compulsive frequency during this period, dozens of them, partly as a way of practicing, and partly, perhaps, because a mirror cost nothing and was always available, and he had himself to look at whenever he needed a model. He met people. This matters too, not as name-dropping, but because ideas travel through people, and in Paris in 1886 and 1887, the ideas that were going to remake Vincent van Gogh were walking around in the form of specific human beings you could talk to in a cafe. He met Camille Pissarro, the oldest of the Impressionists, who was generous and patient with younger painters, and who seems to have taken a genuine interest in Vincent. He met Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, small and brilliant and sardonic, who could outdrink anyone in Montmartre, and who saw in Vincent a fellow outsider, a fellow misfit, and recognized the quality of what he was doing with a clarity that the official art world of Paris had not yet reached. He met Miles Bernard, younger than him by a decade, already certain of himself, already theorizing about what painting should be. He met Paul Signac, who showed him the pointillist method, the individual dots of pure colour, and Vincent tried it and took from it what he needed and left the rest. And he met Paul Gauguin. This is worth saying slowly, because the meeting mattered. Gauguin was 40 years old when he and Vincent first crossed paths in Paris. He was tall, physically imposing, deeply certain of his own genius in a way that Vincent, for all his stubbornness about art, never quite was. Vincent doubted himself constantly, measured himself against the masters, wrote to Theo in letters full of qualified hopes and worried assessments. Gauguin had no such doubts. He had left a career as a stockbroker to paint. He had been to Brittany and would soon go to Martinique and then, eventually, to Tahiti. He was moving away from Impressionism and towards something more symbolic, more flat, more consciously primitive, and he was enormously charismatic about it. He could talk about painting for hours. He had opinions. He held them with the force of a man who expected the world to eventually come around. Vincent was drawn to him. It is not entirely surprising. Vincent's whole life had been a search for fellow feeling, for someone who understood, for the warmth of being known. Theo understood him, but Theo was family, and family is a different kind of knowing. Gauguin understood painting, and he could talk about it, and he could argue about it, and in Paris in 1887 that was enough to make Vincent feel he had found something real. The two men talked, they exchanged ideas, they made an impression on each other. They went their separate ways for a time. Gauguin left Paris, went back to Brittany. But the connection had been made, and it would draw them back together a year later in the south of France, in ways that neither of them could have anticipated from the comfortable, theoretical distance of a Parisian café. But we are not yet in the south of France. We are still in Paris in 1887 and the early weeks of 1888, and the picture you need to hold is this. A man who arrived 2 years ago with a dark, earthbound palette and left with a palette of extraordinary brilliance. The change in Vincent's colour between 1885 and 1888 is one of the most dramatic transformations in the history of painting. The potato eaters and the early sunflowers are almost unbelievably different canvases, and they were made by the same man in roughly 3 years. What happened in between was Paris and light and the company of people who were already seeing colour in a new way, and Vincent's particular, total, uncautious willingness to absorb what was around him and carry it forward into something entirely his own. He was restless in Paris, too. 2 years is a long time to live in a small apartment with your younger brother. Even a brother you love. Even a brother who is supporting you. Theo was patient, but the letters suggest the arrangement was wearing on both of them. Vincent was difficult to live with. His intensity did not switch off in the evening. His need for companionship and his need for solitude existed simultaneously and could not always be reconciled with the practical demands of a shared life. He wanted to cook for Theo and argue about paintings and also be alone for days. He drank more than was good for him. He quarrelled with people and then felt terrible about it. He wrote to Theo at length, even when they were living in the same apartment, because some things were easier to say on paper than across a table. He was, in Paris, both arriving and already beginning to feel the next pull. The city was grey and cold in winter and loud and crowded year-round, and somewhere inside him a counter-argument was building. What if he went south? What if he went to where the light was different, stronger, more direct, less filtered by the particular melancholy of northern European winters? He had seen the Japanese prints. He understood what southern light had done for the painters who worked in it. He talked about Provence the way a person talks about a place they have already decided to go to but haven't admitted it yet. And in February 1888, late February, still cold, the city not yet showing any spring, he got on a train. He was heading for Arles, in the south of France, in the department of Bouches-du-Rhône, a Roman town on the flat plain near the mouth of the Rhône River, where the light in summer was, by all accounts, unlike anything he had known. He was 34 years old. He had been painting for 8 years. He had sold almost nothing. He was living on money Theo sent every month, 150 francs as a rule, enough to eat and pay rent and buy materials if he was careful, not enough for much else. He was heading toward the most productive period of his life. He was heading toward the paintings that would make his name, though he did not know that, and the name would not be made until after he was gone. And the knowledge of that would have been, in any case, of very limited comfort to a man who needed to eat and pay rent now, in the actual present, in February 1888, on a train moving south through the winter countryside of France. But the light was coming. The colour was already in him, already changed from the dark Nuenen years, already bright with everything Paris had given him. And the south was waiting, with its blazing yellow summers and its orchards in blossom and its great flat plains under enormous skies, and somewhere there, in a rented house on a square in Arles, a dream was beginning to form. A dream of a place where painters could live and work together. A community, a brotherhood, a studio of the South, and at the centre of that dream, as welcome and as necessary as water, a friend who was coming. A man he had met in Paris, a tall, certain, difficult, brilliant man who would arrive in the autumn and stay for 9 weeks and change everything. But first there was the train and the snow in the fields outside the window and the slow movement south through a winter landscape that was just beginning, very slowly, to think about spring. And there was the particular quality of stillness that comes at the end of a long day of travel, when you have been moving for hours and the rhythm of the train has become the rhythm of your breathing, and you are neither fully asleep nor fully awake, and the world outside the window passes like a dream, field by field, tree by tree, town by town. Each one smaller and more amber lit than the last as the afternoon deepens toward evening. You can rest in that train, too. The rhythm is easy. The window is cold to the touch, and the carriage is warm, and the seat holds you, and there is nothing to decide or carry until the train arrives. And the train has not arrived yet, and won't for a while. The countryside is going past in the last of the light. The snow is blue in the shadows of the trees. A farmhouse passes, a light in the window, and it is gone. Another field, another line of poplars, another crossing where a cart is waiting and the horse stands patient, head low, breath clouding in the cold. Let the train carry you. Let the fields go by. The story is all here, and it is moving at exactly the right pace, slowly, the way it should be, the way sleep moves, the way memory moves when you let it breathe. The south is ahead. The light is ahead. The yellow house, the sunflowers, the swirling stars, all of it is ahead, waiting in the dark countryside to the south, approaching without hurry. The way all the most important things approach, quietly, in the ordinary dark, when you are not quite watching. Close your eyes for a moment if you want to. The narration will hold you. The train will hold you. You are going somewhere beautiful, and it is not yet time to arrive, and that is fine. That is exactly fine. The night is long, and the story is long, and there is no rush at all, and the snow is still blue in the shadows of the trees. And the light in the farmhouse window is amber and small and kind, and you are moving through the dark of France in 1888, carried by iron and steam through a world about to change, toward a place you have not yet seen. And somewhere to the south, in the city of Arles, there is an empty room above a square, and the light that falls into it in the morning is unlike any light this man has seen before. Not yet. Not quite yet. But soon. He arrived in Arles in February 1888, and the snow was there to meet him. This is not what he had imagined when he thought about the south. He had imagined light, warmth, the brightness he had seen refracted through the impressionist canvases in Paris, the quality of southern air that Japanese woodblock prints seemed to somehow carry. That feeling of clear colour laid flat and confident against the world. He had imagined the Mediterranean palette. And instead, stepping off the train in Arles, there was snow on the ground. The Rhine was the colour of pewter, The old streets of the Roman city were cold and narrow, and the wind came off the plain in long, cold gusts. He found a room. He unpacked his brushes. And then he waited for the light. He had left Paris partly because Paris was exhausting him. 2 years with Theo in the apartment on the Rue Lepich, 2 years of cafes and conversations, and the brilliant, competitive, slightly maddening company of the Impressionists, Camille Pissarro, who was patient with him, Paul Signac, who showed him what pure divided colour could do, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who sketched him in a café in an orange chalk portrait that catches something quick and restless in the face, Mile Bernard, who was barely 20 and already arguing about everything. The arguments, the tobacco smoke, the late nights, the feeling of the city pressing in on every side. He loved it, and it wore him down. He had begun to feel that he needed space. He needed to move more slowly. He needed to find out what he could do when he was not surrounded by other people doing it differently. The South had seemed like the answer. The light in the South, he had been told, was different, more Japanese in a way, that clarity, that flatness, that quality of each thing standing out against the sky without apology. He wanted to go somewhere the sun was not diluted by cloud or city smoke, somewhere he could work outside without freezing, somewhere cheap enough that Theo's money would go further. So Arles, not a famous town, not a painter's destination, just a place on the map that was south and had good train connections and cost less than Nice or Marseille. He arrived in snow and settled in and waited, and the snow went, and then slowly, slowly, the light came. When it came, it was everything he had hoped for. There is a quality to the light in Provence in late winter and spring that is almost aggressive in its directness. The sun in the north of France comes through a gauze of moisture and distance. In Arles, the sky is a different architecture, higher and harder and bluer, and the light falls on things with a kind of insistence, making shadows sharp and colours almost unbearably themselves. Yellow is more yellow. Blue goes deeper than blue should go. The white walls of the farmhouses outside the city are not white. They are a collection of small, vivid patches, cream and pale ochre, and faint violet in the shade, burning clean in the sun. He walked out into it, and he stood there and looked at it, and it was. He wrote to Theo, like Japan. It was exactly like Japan. He began to paint at a pace he had never managed before. The orchards first, almond trees, peach trees, pear trees, all of them flowering at once in the early spring, and he went from one to the next almost frantically, knowing the blossoms would not last, knowing the window was short. Pink blossom against a pale sky, white petals on dark branches. He was working quickly, and the pictures are quick, light, almost breathless, the brushstrokes following the shape of what he saw rather than imposing a formula on it. He painted drawbridges and fishing boats. He painted the plain outside the city, flat and wide under the immense sky. He painted the street at night. That night painting, the caf terrace at night, is one of the first pictures in which you can see the new thing fully assembled. The caf spills its warm lamplight onto the cobblestones, and the people seated at the tables are small and loose and relaxed, and above them the street narrows toward a dark arch, and above the arch the sky is deep blue going on black, and the stars in it are not the small precise points of scientific illustration, but large, soft, radiant things, each one surrounded by a halo of its own light. There is no moon. There is only this, the warm yellow of the caf, and the cold blue of the sky, and the gold of the individual stars, and somehow the street between them holds the two colours together, without either winning. He was teaching himself to see differently. Or perhaps the South was teaching him. Or perhaps Paris had done the teaching already, and the South was simply giving him room to use what he had learned. The colour he had been reaching toward, the colour that the Impressionists had shown him, and Signac had explained to him in the logic of complementary pairs, blue beside orange, yellow beside violet, red beside green. That colour was suddenly available in the world around him without effort. He didn't have to theorize it, he just had to look. He rented a house. This is the next thing, and it matters enormously, because renting the house means he had decided something. He had not come to Arles as a visitor. He was not passing through. He was going to stay, and more than stay, he was going to build something. The house was on the Place Lamartine, right at the edge of the city, 2 stories of pale plaster with green shutters and a deep yellow facade standing on its own between a grocery and the railway bridge. It was not pretty. It was a little battered and ordinary, the kind of building nobody looks at twice. But it had rooms, and the rent was affordable, and the light in the upstairs studio was good in the mornings. He called it the Yellow House. He began to dream about what it could become. The dream was a community. An artist's colony. He called it the Studio of the South, a gathering of painters working together, sharing the cost of living and the cost of materials, pushing each other forward, building something that no single one of them could build alone. The Impressionists had done something like this in their way, meeting in cafes and studios in Paris. But Paris was expensive and competitive, and everyone was pulling in different directions. What he imagined was something calmer. A common life. Painters sleeping in the same house, eating at the same table, working side by side, and spending the evenings looking at each other's work and arguing about it honestly. Something almost monastic in his imagination, except loud, probably, and with a great deal of painting on the walls. He wrote to Theo about it constantly. He wrote to Mile Bernard about it. He wrote, above all, to Paul Gauguin. Gauguin was the artist he admired most in the world at that moment. Older than him, 39 to Vincent's 34, Gauguin was fierce and self-certain in a way that Vincent both envied and found slightly daunting. They had met in Paris, and something had clicked between them. Some recognition of mutual seriousness, though the 2 men were in almost every way opposites. Gauguin was restless in a different direction. He wanted to go further south, further away, further from Europe. He had been to Martinique and wanted to go to Tahiti, wanted the primitive, the uncorrupted, the life outside the city and the gallery and the whole apparatus of European art. Vincent wanted a community. Gauguin was building a mythology of solitude. But they liked each other's work and they respected each other's ambition, and Vincent had convinced himself with the full force of his extraordinary capacity for enthusiasm, which was also his extraordinary capacity for self-deception, that Gauguin would come to Arles, that Gauguin would be the heart of the Studio of the South, that this was going to work. He prepared for the arrival. He painted the bedroom, the simple, clean little room that is now one of his most famous pictures, the narrow bed and the 2 chairs and the window and the yellow walls, everything at that slight angle that suggests rest rather than precision, the whole room leaning gently towards sleep. He hung pictures on the walls of the Yellow House. He bought furniture. He wanted Gauguin to arrive and find a home, not just a room. And then he painted the sunflowers. He painted them over the course of the late summer, in the long hot afternoons of August and September, setting the cut flowers in a vase on the table and working fast, because cut sunflowers droop and wilt and lose their architecture quickly, and he needed to catch them before they did. He painted multiple versions, different numbers of flowers, different vases, different stages of bloom, some just opening and some fully open and some already beginning to turn heavy and spent. He painted them in the yellow of the south, which is a yellow he had been working toward for months, a yellow that has orange in it and a whisper of green in the leaves and stems. And behind the flowers on some of the canvases the background is also yellow, a different yellow, so that the whole picture is a meditation on the range of what yellow can be and do. He painted them for Gauguin. This is the important thing about the sunflowers that most people do not fully absorb. They were not painted as art objects in the abstract. They were painted as decoration, specifically as decorations for the room in the yellow house that was going to be Gauguin's room. He wanted Gauguin to wake up in the morning and see sunflowers on the wall. He wanted the first thing his friend would see, arriving tired from the long journey south, to be these enormous luminous yellow flowers looking down at him like something between a greeting and a gift. A welcome painted in advance, hung on a wall, waiting. He wrote to Theo, "I have an idea that he would really like these." He hoped. Gauguin arrived in late October 1888. The summer light was already thinning toward autumn, and the heat had lifted, and the plane trees along the boulevards had gone gold and were beginning to drop their leaves. The train came in, and Gauguin stepped onto the platform, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man who was not uncertain about himself, and Vincent was there to meet him. And the two of them walked back through the streets of Arles to the Yellow House together. What happened in those 9 weeks is one of those periods in the history of art that everyone knows something about, and almost nobody knows accurately. The popular version is a simple story about madness, a mad painter, a quarrel, an ear. But the actual 9 weeks were something more complicated, something both more mundane and more genuinely sad. The slow accumulation of ordinary friction between two very different people forced into very close quarters. They painted together. They went out into the city and the surrounding countryside together. They argued about painting, which was fine, which was what Vincent had wanted, the honest combat of ideas between two serious artists. They argued about whether to paint from life directly or from imagination and memory, and Gauguin consistently preferred imagination, and Vincent consistently preferred the direct encounter with the visible world. Though the asylum months ahead would show that Vincent could do extraordinary things from memory too. They went to the local brothel together, which was a fact of life for single men in that time and place, and says less about either of them than posterity has sometimes made it say. They drank together. They sat in the Yellow House in the evenings and looked at prints from Japan and talked about colour. And slowly, without anyone intending it, the friction built. Gauguin was not comfortable. He had come partly because Theo had arranged to buy a painting from him each month in exchange for Gauguin living with Vincent and offering him some stability, a financial arrangement that coloured everything, that made Gauguin's presence in Arles feel, at least to Gauguin, less like a freely chosen collaboration and more like a job. He found Arles provincial. He found the Yellow House cramped. He found Vincent, and this is the delicate thing, the thing that is easier to see from outside than either man could see from inside. He found Vincent exhausting in a particular way, the exhausting quality of someone whose enthusiasm and need are both very large, who requires something back from every conversation that is not just agreement, but real response, real engagement, real acknowledgement. Vincent loved Gauguin and wanted Gauguin's love back in the form of commitment to the project, to the Yellow House, to the shared life he had imagined so precisely and so hopefully. Gauguin was already thinking about leaving. He was writing letters about Tahiti. He was talking about how the real primitive art was not in Arles, but somewhere further south and east, somewhere truly outside the European tradition. He was helpful and engaged and intellectually alive and completely, already, somewhere else. And Vincent could feel it. The letters to Theo from this period are full of his effort to project confidence. The studio is going well, Gauguin and I are productive, things are difficult, but that is natural. Two strong personalities will take time to find their rhythm. But between the lines, and sometimes in the lines themselves, there is something else. A thinning of certainty. A quality of hoping too hard, the way you describe a thing as fine when you are using the description to persuade yourself that it is. December came. The light shortened further. The mistral, the cold wind that comes down from the north across the Ray Valley, dry and relentless, sometimes for days at a time, began to blow. The Yellow House was small, and they were inside more than out, and the painting sessions were tighter, and the evenings were longer, and the things that had been just uncomfortable began to feel like pressure. On the evening of 23 December 1888, there was a quarrel. The exact words of the quarrel are not preserved. What happened next is documented partly by the police record and partly by what both men said afterward, and the two accounts differ in detail, as accounts of charged events always do. What is certain is this: that night, Vincent van Gogh took a razor and cut off a significant portion of his left ear. Recent research by the writer Bernadette Murphy, published in 2016, suggests it may have been the entire ear, not merely the lower lobe, as has sometimes been said. The wound Dr. Flix Ray examined was apparently more severe than the lobe-only version of the story implies. But the precise extent of the wound is secondary to what happened after. He wrapped the ear, or the portion of the ear, in cloth. He walked out into the cold December night in Arles, through streets that were quiet, this close to Christmas, and he made his way to a building near the Place Lamartine where a young woman lived. She has been identified in most biographies simply as a woman at the local brothel, sometimes given the name Rachel. Murphy's research suggests she may have been something different, a young farm girl working there as a domestic servant, barely familiar with Vincent, perhaps barely known to him at all. A frightened young woman who opened a door on a December night and found a man standing there with blood on his face, offering her a wrapped package. He asked her to keep it. He asked her to take care of it. She ran for help. He was found and taken to the Hôtel Dieu, the hospital in Arles, where a young doctor named Flix Ray examined him and treated the wound and, in the months that followed, became something like a friend. Dr. Ray was 23 years old, one of those figures who appear at the edge of the story and who leave a small, precise, completely human mark on it. He made a sketch of the ear for a medical friend to show the extent of the injury, and that sketch exists and is part of what researchers have used to reconstruct what actually happened. He was professional and kind and not frightened of his strange patient, which mattered enormously to a man who already had reason to distrust his own capacity to remain stable. Gauguin, upon learning what had happened, did not go to the hospital. He sent a telegram to Theo. He left Arles, and he and Vincent never saw each other again. Vincent spent the early days of January 1889 recovering, and in the strange, fragile calm of convalescence, he painted the self-portrait that shows what he had done and what it had cost. Self-portrait with bandaged ear is not what you might expect a picture made in this aftermath to look like. It is controlled. It is almost quiet. He stands in three-quarter view against a wall, and the bandage covers the left side of his head with surgical plainness, and his expression is neither dramatic nor destroyed. It is simply careful. The eyes, which in his self-portraits are always the place where the information lives, are steady. They look out with a particular quality, not defiance exactly, and not resignation exactly, something between the two, the face of a man who has gotten through something he barely got through and is not entirely sure what to make of it, and is not going to pretend otherwise. Behind him on the wall, pinned at an angle, is a Japanese woodblock print. In the lower right corner, almost an afterthought, is the canvas of an unfinished painting and the frame of an easel. He is still, even now, a painter. That is what the picture says. Even here, even after this. The people of Arles were less understanding. In the weeks after the hospital, when he returned to the Yellow House to try to resume his life, a petition circulated among the local residents asking the mayor to have him institutionalized. They were frightened of him, and they wanted him removed. The mayor complied, and Vincent was placed under temporary supervision. He was not violent and had never threatened anyone. But a man who had cut off his own ear and wandered the streets bleeding on Christmas Eve was not someone the neighborhood felt safe beside. He understood. He did not fight it. And in the spring, in May 1889, he came to a decision on his own. A decision that perhaps says more about his character than almost anything else in the record. He decided, voluntarily, of his own initiative, to commit himself to an asylum. He chose it. He wrote to Theo and said that he thought it would be better, for everyone and for his work, if he were somewhere he could be cared for and observed, somewhere he could paint without frightening anyone. The asylum was called Saint-Paul-de-Moselle in the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, about 15 miles from Arles, set in a converted medieval monastery surrounded by wheat fields and gardens and the low scrubby hills of the Alpes. It was a real psychiatric institution, with real patients in real distress, not a genteel retreat. Vincent was given a room and, crucially, the use of a second room as a studio, and he was allowed to paint. And he painted. This is where it becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind that the most famous pictures he ever made, the canvases that would one day hang in every museum and appear on every postcard and be reproduced on every coffee mug and tote bag and screensaver in the world, were made in an asylum. He was not painting from freedom or from triumph. He was painting from confinement, from a room with a barred window, from a life circumscribed by illness and supervision and the irregular rhythms of breakdown and recovery. He was painting from the particular clarity that sometimes follows the worst moments, the way a fever breaks and the world comes back into focus for a short time with painful precision. The garden at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle was overgrown and wild in places, iris beds and long grass, and the structured remnant of what the monastery garden had once been. He painted the irises first in May 1889, shortly after arriving, great clusters of blue-purple iris flowers, the blooms dense and individual, and each one slightly different in its unfolding, the whole mass of them pushing against the frame of the canvas with a kind of vegetable energy. He painted them from close up, almost inside them, so the viewer feels immersed rather than distanced, the way you feel when you actually kneel in a garden among flowers rather than standing above them. The irises have a wildness in them that the formal garden never quite contained. He loved that. He painted the corridor of the asylum, the vaulted stone arches of the old monastery going away into perspective. He painted the garden from various angles. He painted his own room, again, as he had painted his room in the yellow house, and this version is darker and stranger, the perspective more tilted, as though the room itself is uncertain of its geometry. He painted the patients in the institution, though this is less well known, quiet interior scenes, men gathered around a stove, the particular quality of light in a room where people are waiting for something without knowing what. He painted olive trees. He painted cypresses. The cypresses are extraordinary things, the canvases he made of them at Saint-Rémy. Cypress trees in Provence are narrow and dark, pointed things that cut the skyline vertically, associated with cemeteries and with the South's particular way of marking boundaries between properties and roads. He painted them as if they were made of flame. The brushstrokes that compose them spiral and twist, not in a random way, but in a systematic way. As though the trees are turning about their own vertical axis, their dark green going almost black in the shadows and nearly viridian in the light, and the sky around them moves too. The brushstrokes in the sky circling in long arcs, the clouds rolling in organized turbulence. The wind in these pictures is a real force, a physical entity with direction and intention. The trees resist it and bend in it and keep their shape through it, and the tension between the solidity of the trees and the movement of everything around them is what makes the pictures feel alive. He was working in cycles here at Saint-Rémy. There would be weeks of clear-eyed, furious productivity, canvases accumulating faster than the orderlies could carry them to the studio. His mind racing and lucid, and the work pouring out with an assurance that makes the dates of these pictures almost impossible to credit. And then a crisis would come, sometimes sudden, sometimes building over days, and he would be unable to paint, unable to think clearly, and he would lie in the room and wait for it to pass, and it would pass, and he would go back to work. He described the crises himself in the letters to Theo with a precision that is both analytical and somehow dissociated, as though he were describing a weather event he was observing from a distance rather than something happening inside his own skull. He did not know what they were. Dr. Ray in Arles had suspected a form of epilepsy. The doctors at Saint-Rémy were cautious. Everyone looking at it afterward has had a different theory: temporal lobe epilepsy, bipolar disorder, some interaction of illness and the physical effects of the lead in the paint he used, and the turpentine he sometimes drank during the worst moments, the long-term effect of absinthe. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The record is there, and the symptoms are there, and the labels shift depending on who is doing the labeling, and what remains true through all the shifting labels is that he suffered, and he continued to work, and he was not reducible to either. In June 1889, during a period of recovery and lucidity, he painted The Starry Night. The view from his room at St. Paul de Moselle faced east toward the Alpilles and the open country before them, and in the early mornings before sunrise he could see the stars setting in that direction through the bars of his window. He had written to Theo about the night sky there, about the quality of the darkness in that part of Provence, about how the stars were visible in a way they never quite were in cities where the lamplight dimmed them. He was paying attention to it. He was carrying it. When he painted the starry night, he did not paint it in the night, in front of the sky. He painted it from memory, from imagination, from the accumulated bank of observations he had been making, from the sketches he had made from the window, from whatever it is that happens in a painter's mind between seeing a thing and making it. The painting was made in the studio, probably in the daytime, working from a drawing and from what he held inside him. The sky in it is not the sky over Saint-Rémy, or rather, it is the sky over Saint-Rémy transformed by everything he needed it to be. The stars are enormous, each one a swirling corona of light, and the space between them moves in long rolling waves, blue into blue-green into dark blue, into the particular almost black of the deepest sky, and the crescent moon in the upper right burns with its own separate fire, a different yellow from the stars, more orange, more urgent. The hills at the bottom of the picture, the Alpes, rolling and low, correspond to what he could actually see from his window. The cypress in the lower left, dark and upward reaching, is real. Cypresses grew in the asylum grounds. The village is not real. The village in the lower third of the painting, with its church steeple rising in the centre and its cluster of warm-lit houses. The windows with their gentle orange glow, the roads winding between them, the whole scale of it small and human and domestic against the enormous turbulent sky, does not correspond to any actual place. Saint-Rémy itself was off to one side, not visible from his window in this direction. He invented the village. He placed it there because the picture needed it, because the sky needed something below it to give it scale and to make human life present in all that enormous turning darkness. The steeple in particular is interesting, a Dutch steeple, a northern steeple, not the squat Romanesque tower of a Provençal church, but the tall pointed kind he had grown up with in Brabant. He was painting from memory in more ways than one. And the sky keeps moving. That is the thing about the starry night that no reproduction fully conveys, the sense that the paint itself is in motion, that the stars are not fixed but circling, that the clouds are rolling genuinely, that if you watched it long enough, the whole composition would complete one slow revolution and begin again. He painted sky as a living thing, sky as a process rather than a backdrop, sky as something that had its own life and direction, regardless of the small, warm, invented village below it trying to hold itself together under all that turbulence and dark. He painted it, and he was not sure about it. He wrote to Theo that he thought the night study was a failure. He was not always able to see what he had made, that is true of most painters, but for him it seems to have been particularly acute, the gap between his ambition and his assessment of the result. He set it aside and went on painting. Olive groves, more cypresses, the view from the window again, with the rising sun over the Alpes, the reapers in the wheat field, which he made as a painting of the most ordinary violent fact of harvest, that the standing wheat is being cut, that what lived in the field is being ended row by row, and he told Theo he found it calming, somehow to paint it. The image of death at work in the world, and he found it calming. He was perhaps further along in his accommodation with that idea than he knew. The irises came in large numbers. He was drawn back to them again and again, to the beds of purple-blue flowers in the asylum garden, and the way the individual blooms held their form against the chaos of the surrounding plants. He made close studies of them, versions in which a single iris stem takes up most of the canvas, the petals unfolding in such precise and complex curves that the picture becomes almost scientific. Here is what an iris is. Here is the exact geometry of its unfolding, and it is this exact and beautiful thing. And he made broader views, the whole bed, the irises in mass, the green of the stems and the leaves going every direction, while the flowers hold their colour above. And these are the pictures that feel most like an argument that beauty persists regardless. He was making, in those months at Saint-Rémy, an argument through paint. Not in words, he made it in words too, in the letters to Theo, constantly. The letters which are also one of the strangest and richest bodies of writing any painter ever left, a running autobiography and aesthetic treatise and emotional diary all at once, but in paint the argument was simpler and more fundamental. It went something like this: I am here. I am in this difficult place, in these difficult circumstances, and my mind is sometimes my enemy, and I am not always able to stand upright against what happens inside it. But I am here, and I am looking, and I am finding that the world still has irises in it. And that matters. It matters to look at them carefully and to paint them as carefully as I can, and to put the results somewhere someone else can also look. That is what I have. That is what I can do. That is what I will keep doing as long as I can do it. The olive groves he made at Saint-Rémy have a particular quality that is different from everything else. The olive tree is one of the oldest cultivated things in the Mediterranean world, planted by the Phoenicians and the Greeks, tended for thousands of years in groves that are themselves thousands of years old, and the trees show it, gnarled and twisted and bent, their grey-green leaves in constant motion in the slightest wind, their trunks heavy with the slow accumulation of growth. He painted them with the same turbulent brushstroke he used for the cypresses and the starry night sky, the strokes following the movement of the branches and the light through the leaves, and the result is that the olive trees look as though they are made of the same stuff as the sky, turning, living, in perpetual negotiation with the air around them. They look ancient and alive simultaneously, which is what they are. In his room, in the evenings after the painting was done for the day, he made copies. This is something about him that is often overlooked. He taught himself by copying, not as a student copies to learn technique, but as a devoted reader returns to a beloved book. He made copies of Rembrandt, of Millet, of Delacroix, working from black and white reproductions because that is all he had, and translating them into colour, not the original colour, since he couldn't see that, but the colour he imagined they should have, the colour that felt right to him. He made his own piette, his own sower. He was in dialogue with the history of painting even here, even in the asylum, even in the periods when the dialogue was the only coherent thing happening in his mind. He had been at St. Paul de Mossoul for nearly a year. He had produced in that year over 150 paintings. He had survived several serious crises. He had made the Starry Night and irises and the olive groves and the cypresses and the wheat fields and the reapers. He had written hundreds of letters. He had copied old masters from memory and imagination. He had looked out through the barred window at the Alpilles every morning and evening and carried the sight of them inside him and made something from it. And now, in the spring of 1890, a letter arrived from Theo. Theo and his wife Johanna, Jo, everyone called her, had had a child, a son, born on 31 January 1890. They had named him Vincent Willem, after the uncle he would probably never meet. Theo wrote to describe the birth, and wrote that Vincent's paintings were hanging in their apartment in Paris, over the baby's crib and along the walls of the rooms, and that the child would grow up surrounded by his uncle's work. He read this letter and wept. He said so in the letter he wrote back. There is something about that image, the newborn nephew in a Paris apartment. The paintings on the walls, the world continuing its ordinary miraculous business of being born and named, that broke open something in him that the asylum walls had been holding closed. He was an uncle. There was a child named Vincent Willem. The work was on the walls. Theo was there, and Joe was there, and the child was there, and he was here, behind bars, still painting, still alive. He began to think about leaving, not recklessly. He was careful about it, writing to Dr. Perron, who was in charge at St. Paul de Mosole, writing to Theo, asking the questions slowly and from different angles over several months. He was frightened of what might happen if he left and was not prepared. He had seen how quickly things could change, how the crises came without warning, how the ground he thought was solid could simply give way beneath him. He did not want to go back to Arles. He did not want to be alone. What he wanted was to be closer to Theo, to be somewhere in France near Paris, reachable, not isolated by the long train journey south. And Theo had heard of a doctor, a physician who lived in a village north of Paris and who had a special sympathy for artists, who had been treating creative people for years, who was himself a painter in an amateur way, a collector, a man who would understand what Vincent was and what he needed. His name was Dr. Paul Gauguin, and he lived in Auvers-sur-Oise. But that is ahead, that is the next chapter, and it comes in its own time, as all of it comes, slowly without hurry, the way this story has always moved. The way sleep moves, the way memory unspools in the dark, when the day is finally finished, and the night is long enough to hold everything you have been carrying and let it settle, gently, into something almost like rest. The air at Saint-Rémy in the late spring of 1890 is warm already, the lavender beginning to purple the hillsides, the wheat standing tall and golden in the fields outside the asylum walls, the cypress trees dark against the sky. He is packing his things. He is carefully rolling the canvases. He is saying goodbye to the doctors who have cared for him, and to the garden where the irises grow, and to the barred window where the stars were visible in the early mornings before the sun came up. He has made nearly 150 paintings here. He has made the Starry Night. He does not know how famous it will one day be. He thinks, still, that it is a failure. He knows only that he made it, that it is finished, that it is rolled and wrapped and packed with the others, and that it is time to go north. The train carried him north in May of 1890, through the green fields of Provence, still warm with spring, through the sprawling edges of Paris, and then out again into the quieter countryside north of the city, where the Oise River wound its slow way through pale green valleys, and the villages sat small and unhurried along its banks. Auvers-sur-Oise. He arrived there the 20th of May. He was 37 years old, he was thin, and he was tired, and he was also, in some way that doesn't fit neatly into words, quietly hopeful. The worst of the crises seemed behind him. The doctors at Saint-Rémy had seen no episode in the final weeks. He had packed more than 150 canvases. He had packed the Starry Night, though he did not call it that, or think of it that way, or suspect for even a moment that it would one day hang in a great museum in New York and become the most reproduced painting in the world. He knew only that it was done, and that he was moving on. Dr. Paul Gauguin met him at the inn. The man was 62, white-haired, energetic, a little scattered in his enthusiasms, a homeopath by training, a physician by practice, an amateur painter by inclination, a collector of art by passion and habit. He had treated Pissarro, he had known San. He was comfortable around artists in a way that most village doctors were not, which was precisely why Theo had sought him out. why letters had been exchanged, why this arrangement had been made. Gachet would look after Vincent informally, not as a patient in a ward, not behind locked doors, but as a neighbour, as a friend of sorts, as someone who would notice if things went wrong, and who would know what to do. The inn was the Auberge Ravoux, run by Arthur Gustave Ravoux and his wife and their daughter Adeline, a girl of 13 who would later remember Vincent clearly. A quiet man, she said, who paid his rent, who kept to himself mostly, who was up early and out late with his canvases and his paint box, who did not frighten her, but who had something about him, some quality she couldn't name as a child, but tried to name much later when the world wanted to know what he had been like. He painted Gachet almost immediately. Portrait of Dr. Gachet, he made 2 versions of it in June of 1890. In both of them, Gachet sits with his head resting on his hand, his eyes heavy, his expression carrying something Vincent described in a letter to Theo as the heartbroken expression of our time. He meant something real by that. He was not being decorative. He saw in the doctor a man who had absorbed too much of other people's suffering, who had spent too many years looking at what art could do to a person, what devotion to it could cost, what the attempt could take from a life, and who wore that knowledge in his face without being able to put it down. Vincent found that legible. He found it familiar. He painted what he recognized. The portrait itself, the original, would one day sell for roughly $82.5 million. This was in 1990, 100 years after the paint dried in the upstairs room of a country doctor's house in a small French village. The man who bought it was a Japanese industrialist named Ryohei Saito, and the price set a record at the time for any work of art sold at auction. Vincent had painted it in a single sitting, as he often worked in a kind of focused urgency that people mistook for rashness, but was actually something more like complete attention, the whole self thrown at the canvas all at once, nothing held back for later. He painted everything that way, here at the end. That was the thing about those final weeks in Auvers. There were roughly 70 days between his arrival in May and the last morning of July, and in those 70 days he made roughly 70 paintings. One a day, sometimes more. The wheat fields outside the village, the church at Auvers, its blue-grey stone made vivid and slightly unreal, the sky behind it, that same restless swirling motion he had found in Saint-Rémy, as though the air itself could not hold still. Thatched cottages, the Oise at dusk, portraits of Adeline Ravoux, peasants in their gardens. He wrote to Theo that he felt a great drive to work. He used the word frenzy and then seemed to qualify it, to say it was a calm frenzy, which sounds contradictory but makes a kind of sense if you have ever worked very hard on something you loved and found that the speed of the work did not feel frantic, but instead felt like the only natural pace, the one at which everything else finally stopped being noise. He was also, underneath this, frightened. Not in a way he said plainly. He didn't write letters full of dread. But between the lines, in the questions he asked Theo about the state of the art market, about whether Theo's employer was treating him well, about the health of Theo's wife Jo and their baby son, a boy they had named Willem after Vincent himself, between all those careful brotherly questions, there was something Vincent was watching, some calculation he was always running. He understood that Theo's support was not unlimited. He understood that Theo was unwell, that the consumption that had troubled him for years was getting worse, that the burden of the monthly allowance was real. He worried that he was a weight around his brother's neck. He worried this out loud sometimes and then pulled back from it, tried to be cheerful, described the village, described the paintings, made Theo see what he was seeing. This is how you read the letters, if you read them carefully. Not just as the letters of a troubled man, but as the letters of a person who understood completely what was happening around him and who was doing his best, with the tools he had, to stay. They were writing to each other all the time those last weeks. Vincent to Theo, Theo to Vincent, Theo to Joe, Joe to Theo. A web of paper crossing and recrossing the distance between Auvers and Paris, which was not very far, an hour by train, but far enough that they were not always in the same room, far enough that the letters had to carry what a visit might have handled in a glance. There were, in the end, more than 900 letters in Vincent's surviving correspondence. More than 650 of them were to Theo. They begin when Vincent is a young man at Goupil and Siey in The Hague, writing cheerfully about paintings he has seen and sold. And they end in the days before the gunshot in July of 1890. Over nearly 2 decades they move through every failure and every beginning, every love affair and religious crisis, every dark winter in a Belgian mining town, and every luminous afternoon in a Provençal garden. They are written in Dutch and French and English. They are sometimes rambling and sometimes precise, sometimes full of despair and sometimes full of a kind of wild, specific joy. A particular tree he has seen, a particular light on a particular afternoon, a colour he cannot describe in words and is going to have to paint instead. Taken together, they are the greatest self-portrait he ever made. Not the self-portraits on canvas, of which there are dozens, each one a different face and a different pair of eyes looking out at you from across the room. The letters are the real portrait. They are the record of a mind working, a feeling heart trying to put itself into language the way paint tries to put itself into light, and they would not have survived without Theo, who kept every one of them, who bundled and saved them even during the years when the brothers were estranged, when weeks passed without contact, who understood that whatever was happening between them in any given season, the letters were not to be discarded. By the summer of 1890 in Auvers, something was shifting in the larger world, very quietly, just beginning to move. It had begun, actually, months earlier. In January of 1890, while Vincent was still at St. Paul de Mossoul, a young critic named Albert Aurier had published an article in the Mercure de France. The Mercure de France was a literary and cultural journal, serious, read by people in the Paris art world who paid attention to such things. Aurier's piece was called Les Isoles, Vincent van Gogh, The Isolated Ones, Vincent van Gogh, and it was the first substantial critical praise the painter had ever received. Aurier wrote about Vincent's work with real heat and intelligence, arguing that it was something new, something powerful, that the colours and the forms were doing things other painters were not doing and could not do. He used words like visionary. He meant them. Vincent read the article. Theo sent it to him. And Vincent's response, in a letter to Aurier thanking him for the piece, was characteristic and a little heartbreaking. He said the praise properly belonged to Theo, without whose support nothing would have been possible, and he said the article made him uneasy, that he was not sure he deserved it, that the work was imperfect, that he was still a student. He was genuinely unnerved, not by hostility, he had lived with hostility for years, but by this sudden kindness from a stranger who had looked at the paintings and found something in them that Vincent could not quite see himself. And there was this too, earlier that same year, in February of 1890, at an exhibition in Brussels organized by a group called Les XX. 20 avant-garde artists who showed together, who believed in the new and the strange and the formally daring. Vincent's work had been shown. Several paintings were on the wall, and one of them was sold. The Red Vineyard, a canvas showing workers harvesting grapes in the autumn light, the vines burning a deep crimson against a golden sky. A Belgian painter and collector named Anna Bock bought it. She paid 400 francs. 400 francs, that was the number. One sale. One buyer who wanted, for 400 francs, to own a piece of what Vincent had made. There were other transactions. He had traded paintings, given some away, sold a drawing or two. But if you are asking about a clean sale, a stranger with money who looked at his work and decided it was worth something, the Red Vineyard and Anna Bock and 400 francs is the answer. And it came at the very end, in the last year of his life, when the possibility of recognition had just barely begun to materialize at the edges of the horizon, barely visible, the way a light comes up before you can truly call it dawn. He never knew how close he was. Not really. He knew about the Brussels sale. He knew about Aurier's article. He knew these things intellectually. The way you know a statistic, he could tell you the fact, he could write it in a letter to Theo. But to internalize it, to feel it in the chest the way a person feels that they have finally been seen, that seems to have been harder. The habit of failure had been too long and too thorough. The years of rejection had done something to the mechanism by which good news is received, had calcified it somehow, made it difficult for the warmth to enter. And then it was July. The wheat was high. The summer in Auvers was heavy and very warm, the kind of heat that presses down on everything and makes the afternoons slow. He had been painting the wheat fields obsessively, these wide, flat plains under enormous skies, canvases in which the horizon sits very low and the sky takes up most of the picture, dramatic and churning and alive. He painted crows rising from a field, wheat field with crows, those ragged black shapes ascending from the gold. There has been a great deal of written about what this painting means, about whether it is a farewell, about whether the crows flying upward mean departure, or whether the road that runs into the field and then simply stops means something about reaching an end. These interpretations were made after the fact, by people who knew how the story finished. He made the painting because he was looking at wheat and crows in the July light, and he wanted to paint them. On July the 27th, 1890, he went out into the fields. He was shot. What happened exactly, what the precise sequence of events was, who pulled the trigger, whether it was his own hand or another's, is a question that has never been finally settled. Though the traditional account says it was self-inflicted, that he shot himself in the chest with a revolver in or near a wheat field, and that he then walked back to the Auberge Revue, climbed the stairs to his room, and lay down. A minority view, argued most forcefully by the scholars Stephen Neiffer and Gregory White-Smith in a biography published in 2011, proposes that Vincent did not shoot himself at all, that he was accidentally shot by local youths, young men from the village who had been teasing him, and that he chose to cover for them, to say nothing, to allow the wound to be read as self-inflicted because he did not want to make trouble, because he was tired, because perhaps a part of him did not object to what had happened. This theory focuses on a young man named Ren Sekotan, who was known to have a gun. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which has studied the documentary record more thoroughly than perhaps anyone else, does not accept this theory. The suicide account remains the consensus. What is agreed upon is this: he was wounded by a bullet to the chest. He walked back to the inn. He was found in his room by Arthur Ravoux. A doctor was called. The wound was not immediately fatal, but neither could it be treated here, in a village, without the right equipment or skill. Vincent lay in his small room for 2 days. Someone sent word to Theo. Theo came. He arrived on the 28th and sat beside his brother through the night. They talked. They spoke in Dutch, their mother tongue, the language in which they had written to each other for nearly 20 years. The language of Groot Zundert and their father, the pastor, and the churchyard, with its 2 headstones, and the flat green fields of North Brabant in the early morning. What they said to each other in that room is not recorded. What Theo wrote afterward to their mother was that the end came quietly, and that Vincent did not suffer greatly at the last. Vincent van Gogh died on the 29th of July, 1890. He was 37 years old. Theo was beside him. His last words, as Theo later reported them, were "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. It is a strange thing to say at the end, not "I am afraid" or "I am ready" or any of the things people reach for in those moments. Just that plain, declarative sentence. The sadness will last forever. As though he was not speaking about himself particularly, but about something larger, the sadness that is woven into things. The grief that sits beneath the surface of ordinary days and does not go away when the individual who feels it does. He was buried in the municipal cemetery at Auvers-sur-Oise on the 30th of July. Several artists came. Gachet was there, weeping, barely able to speak. Mile Bernard was there and wrote about it afterward, the sunflowers cut from someone's garden and laid on the coffin, the simple words said in the heat of the summer afternoon, the sense of a life that had been incompletely seen. The canvases were propped against the walls of the room downstairs while the service was prepared. Someone counted them later. There were 80. 80 unfinished arguments with light. Theo did not live long after. He had been ill for years, the same slow consumption that was running through the family, and the shock of Vincent's death did something to what little resilience he had left. He collapsed in September, just 2 months after. He was hospitalized. He declined quickly, confusingly, his mind beginning to give way as well as his body, in the way that serious grief sometimes hastens what illness has already begun. He was brought to Utrecht, where he was cared for in a clinic. He died in January of 1891. Theo van Gogh was 33 years old, 4 years younger than Vincent. The brother who had stood at the beginning of everything, who had written the first of those hundreds of letters, who had sent the monthly allowance of 150 francs that paid for the paint and the canvas and the rooms and the food, who had believed in the work when no one else did, who had carried Vincent's name in the Paris art world with careful, quiet persistence, was gone 6 months after the man he had spent his adult life sustaining. The paintings were left, the letters were left, nearly 2,000 works, almost none of them sold, and a trunk of correspondence that no one had yet published, that most of the world did not know existed, that recorded in extraordinary detail the mind and heart of the man who had made all those canvases during that compressed, furious, unlikely decade. These things passed to Theo's widow. Her name was Johanna van Gogh-Bonger, and she was 28 years old when her husband died, with a baby son, not yet a year old, and she had inherited something that must have been deeply confusing in its dimensions, both a burden and a mystery, and perhaps, if she let herself think about it carefully, something else as well. She was from Amsterdam. She had met Theo through her brother Andries Bonger, who was a friend of Theo's, and she and Theo had married in 1889 and had a very short life together before it ended. She had met Vincent only a few times. She had found him difficult, loud, overwhelming in his enthusiasms, strange in his manner. She had not known, from those handful of meetings, what to make of him. But she read the letters. That is the thing that changed everything. The pivot point around which the whole story turns, the moment from which the posthumous fame flows. Johanna van Gogh-Bonger sat down with the trunk of correspondence, more than 650 letters from Vincent to Theo, the record of 20 years of a life written in 3 languages in handwriting that ranged from careful to frantic. And she read them, all of them, in order from the first to the last. And she understood what she was holding. She understood that these letters were not just a biographical record. She understood that they were themselves a kind of art, a sustained, self-aware, searching piece of writing that contained everything that the paintings could not say about where they came from and what they had cost, and what the man who made them had believed about the world and about painting, and about the relationship between suffering and beauty, and about his brother, always his brother. Always Theo at the other end of the distance, always Theo reading and responding and sending the money and saying, "Keep going, keep going." She did not sell the paintings. This is the decision that changed the history of art and must be said plainly, because it was not an inevitable decision or an obvious one. She was a widow with a young son, and she had a collection of canvases that were beginning, just barely, to attract attention from dealers and collectors who could sense that something was happening here, that these pictures might be worth something. She could have sold them. Many people in her position would have sold them. The responsible thing, the conventional thing, the financially reasonable thing would have been to convert the collection into money and use it to raise her child. She did not. She chose instead to become the curator of a life's work. And the word curator is too passive, too institutional. It suggests someone who tends to things in a neutral, preservationist way. What Jo did was something far more active. She organized exhibitions. She lobbied critics. She loaned paintings to galleries in Amsterdam, in Paris, in Germany, in cities that had never heard the name Van Gogh. She wrote catalogue essays. She wrote to museums. She wrote to artists and collectors and anyone who might look at what she had and see what she saw. And she published the letters. In 1914, 24 years after Vincent's death, 23 after Theo's, Johanna van Gogh-Bonger published the correspondence. She edited it carefully, wrote an introduction that was itself a small masterpiece of biographical writing, a portrait of Vincent drawn from intimate knowledge and careful research, and she put it into the world. The book was published in Dutch, and then translated again, and it did something that no exhibition alone could have done. It gave the paintings a voice. A person, a mind behind the brushstrokes, a life behind the canvases, a human being who had thought and felt and struggled and loved his brother and failed at everything before art, and failed at art in the sense that the world would not pay him for it, and then made anyway, in those 10 strange years, this extraordinary body of work that sat in a widow's house in Amsterdam, waiting to be recognized. The recognition came, slowly at first, and then all at once, in the way these things happen, the slow accumulation of attention, and then a tipping point, and then suddenly Van Gogh was not an obscure painter that some people in Paris had heard of, but a name, a figure, a face from the self-portraits that people knew the way they knew any famous face, by its outline and its expression. by those deep-set eyes under the russet brow, looking out with that particular intensity, that quality of looking that has never quite been duplicated. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam opened in 1973, 3 years after what would have been his 120th birthday. It holds the largest collection of his work in the world, paintings, drawings, letters, the whole range of the decade. And it stands in the Museumplein, the great open square at the heart of the city, and people line up to enter it from every country on earth, and every background, and every age. People who have never thought much about painting, people who have spent their lives in galleries, people who know the name and are curious about the face behind it, people who do not know the name at all and have simply been brought here by a travelling companion and who will leave with something changed in them, some small door opened. Irises, the painting made in the garden of St. Paul de Mausole in those first days at the asylum, when he was trying to keep his hands busy and his mind steady, sold in 1987 for roughly $53.9 million. The sunflowers, those same flowers he had painted in the Yellow House to welcome a friend, sold that same year for roughly $39.7 million. And the portrait of Dr. Gachet, painted in June of 1890 in the country doctor's house in Auvers, the melancholy face of the man with the heartbroken expression of our time, was bought at auction in 1990 for approximately $82.5 million. He sold one painting in his life for 400 francs. He sold the Red Vineyard to Anna Bock, a Belgian painter who wanted it, and she paid 400 francs, and he wrote about it to Theo, matter-of-factly, the way you report a small and unexpected good thing. This is how money came in, when it came in at all, not from his work, but from his brother. Always from his brother. And here is the thing that this story is about, finally, the thing that has been building since the headstone in the churchyard of Groot Zundert, since the boy who walked past his own name carved in stone on his way to school, since the chain of failures and the collapse in the Borinage coalfields, and the decision at 27 to become an artist with almost no training and less than a decade to live. The story is not about a man who made great paintings and then died unknown. It is about a man who made great paintings and was then carried into the future by two other people. By his brother, who gave him the money and the letters and the belief for 10 years without ceasing, and by his brother's widow, who was left with a trunk and a collection and a decision to make, and who made the right one, and who spent the rest of her life making sure that the world caught up to what had happened in those small rooms in The Hague and Arles and Saint-Rémy and Auvers. Jo van Gogh-Bonger had Theo's body reburied beside Vincent in Auvers. She arranged this years after Theo's death, went through the formal process, had him brought from Utrecht, laid him next to his brother in the Auvers Municipal Cemetery, where the wheat fields are close and the summer sky is wide. They are there together now, the two graves side by side under a covering of ivy, in the shade of trees, in a small French town that most of the world would never have heard of if two brothers had not lived and died and written letters to each other across the distances of a difficult decade. People come to see the graves. They come from far away. As people do for graves, they feel they have been told to visit by the work of the person inside. They stand for a moment. They look at the two names, at the two dates, at the ivy that covers both headstones equally. And perhaps some of them think about the irony. The boy who walked past a gravestone bearing his own name at the beginning of his life, and who ended up here, in a grave that looks exactly like the one he grew up beside, except that this time his name was earned, this time it was his. Or perhaps they don't think any of that. Perhaps they just stand quietly for a moment in the French summer, with the wheat somewhere beyond the cemetery wall, and then they turn and walk back toward the village and the inn and the world. The sadness will last forever. He said that. The sadness will last forever, and it is true in the way that certain plain sentences are true. Not as a comfort and not quite as a despair, but as a fact about the weather of human life, the way rain is a fact, the way summer ends. The sadness does last. It moves through the letters and through the paintings and through the century and a half that has passed since a man with a bandaged ear sat in a yellow room in Provence and looked at himself in a mirror and tried to paint what he saw honestly, without making it better or worse than it was. But here is the other thing that lasts. That also lasts. And lasts just as long. The canvases, the wheat turning in the light, the irises purple against the dark earth of the asylum garden, the stars wheeling over a village that never existed except in the mind of a man who looked out a barred window before sunrise and imagined what a peaceful place might look like below the sky. The sunflowers standing in a blue-walled room, painted for a friend who was coming to stay. All that yellow brightness assembled as a kind of welcome, as a kind of hope, as an ordinary human act of wanting someone to feel at home when they arrived. He made roughly 2,000 of these things in 10 years, from almost nothing, with almost no one watching, on a monthly allowance of 150 francs from a brother who believed in him, without quite being able to explain why. And he died believing he had failed. He had not failed. He had simply not lived long enough to see what his life had already built. He had not lived long enough to read the letters that would be published in 1914, the letters that would give his name to people who had never been in a gallery. He had not lived long enough for the Van Gogh Museum, or for the auction houses and the staggering numbers, or for the endless reproductions on the walls of rooms in every country, the Starry Night printed on everything from coffee cups to dormitory posters, which is vulgarization of a kind but is also evidence that the image found its way into the common life of the world and stayed there the way only a very few images ever do. He had not lived long enough to see any of it, but Jo van Gogh-Bonger lived long enough. She died in 1925, 35 years after Vincent, 34 after Theo. She had spent most of those years building the bridge between the work and the world, painting by painting, exhibition by exhibition, letter by letter. She was the third devotion in this story, and the one most often forgotten. The woman who arrived at the end of 2 lives and turned what remained into a gift for everyone who came after. Her son, the Willem, for whom the Willem in Van Gogh's middle name was revived, continued what she had started, and it came down through the family and eventually into the museum on the Museumplein in Amsterdam, where it still lives. That museum is where the Starry Night is not. As it happens, the Starry Night is in New York, at the Museum of Modern Art, where it has been since 1941, on a wall in a room where people stand before it and feel what they always feel, which is difficult to name precisely, but has something to do with recognition, with the sense that whoever made this was describing something real about the way the world actually looks when you cannot sleep and the night is very large and the stars are doing something the daytime sky never does, turning and breathing, full of emotion that might be terrifying or might be beautiful depending on how you hold it. Depending on whether you look at it as a man in an asylum looking out at something beyond the bars, or as the painting itself, which has no bars, which is pure sky, which is pure night, which is the world remade in the colours of someone who had looked at it for 10 years, with his whole attention, and found it. underneath everything, astonishing. He looked at the world and found it astonishing. That is what the paintings say, if you let them say it. Not that it was easy, or that the suffering was worth it, or that there is a lesson to be taken away and applied to daily life. Just that he looked, and what he saw was astonishing, and he put it down as faithfully as he could, stroke by stroke, season by season, in the rooms and fields of the 10 years he had, and then it was done, and the world eventually looked back. The wheat fields of Auvers are still there. The fields he painted in those last 70 days, those wide-open plains under the wide-open sky, are still fields. People grow things in them. The sun comes up over them in the morning, the same way it came up over them in the summer of 1890. And the crows are still there too, probably, lifting from the grain in that ragged black scatter, not meaning anything, just being crows, just living in the field the way things live in fields, without any awareness of having been painted. He saw them and painted them. That is all. It is also everything. The small room at the Auberge still exists. The inn is still standing, still called that, and you can go into the room if you want to, a low-ceilinged space, not much larger than a generous closet, with a small window that looks out over the rooftops of the village. There is very little in it. There does not need to be. The room is what it is, the last room. The room where a man lay down with a bullet in his chest and waited for his brother to come, and where the brother came, and where, 2 days later, it ended. But the paintings left the room long before that. They left it packed into rolls and crates and carried under his arm, and shipped in tubes to Paris and sent to exhibitions in Brussels, and stored in Theo's apartment, and eventually loaded into the great archive that Jo inherited and spent her life opening up, piece by piece, to the world. They left the room, and they are everywhere now. Which is the thing that would have surprised him most, probably. Not that they were worth money, not that critics eventually praised them, but that they were simply everywhere. That people who had never thought about painting and never would have seen the starry night and kept it somewhere in their minds, that the image had made it into the common human store of things that we all somehow share. The images that float through a culture like furniture through a house, present and familiar, and perhaps no longer consciously looked at, but still there, still sitting in the corner, still doing their quiet work. He could not have imagined that. He could not have imagined the museum or the auction records or the reproductions or the books. He wrote to Theo in those last weeks from Auvers that he was worried about whether the work had any value. He wrote that he was not sure. He wrote that the paintings accumulated and he did not know what to do with them. He wrote that Theo should not feel burdened by the amount of canvas piling up in his apartment. The canvas is still there, in a way. The canvas is everywhere. It is in Amsterdam and New York, and in every gallery that has borrowed or lent, and in every book that has reproduced, and in every room where someone has pinned a print to a wall because the image meant something to them. Because the swirling sky, or the yellow room, or the irises in their blue-green intensity had reached through whatever distance exists between a dead painter and a living person, and said something that required no translation, that needed no explanation, that arrived already understood. The headstone in Grootzundert that bore his name before he was born is gone now, or at least its inscription has long since worn away. The first Vincent van Gogh, the stillborn boy of March 1852, is not remembered apart from this story, apart from his brother's story, which is the only reason anyone looks for that grave at all. But the second Vincent van Gogh, the living one, the replacement child who walked past his own name on his way to school and who grew up somehow carrying the weight of a life that had not been lived. He left the evidence everywhere. He left it in the paint. He left it in the letters. He left it in the quiet devotion of a brother who believed in him and a widow who refused to let the world look away. They carried him forward, those two. They carried him into the fame that arrived too late for him to feel. And perhaps that is the most human part of this whole long story, not the genius, not the suffering, not the dramatic nights and the asylum and the ear and the wheat field in July. The most human part is that the person who made the work never got to see what the work became. The most human part is that he needed someone to believe in him, and someone did, and it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything. He died on the 29th of July, 1890, in a small room above an inn in a French village with his brother beside him. 37 years old. Nearly 2,000 works, almost nothing sold. And the sadness, yes, the sadness lasts. He said so, and he was right. But so does the wheat in the golden light. So do the stars in their long, slow turning above a village the painter invented, because the real one did not look the way the sky deserved. So do the sunflowers, standing in the yellow room, painted for a friend who was coming, full of the particular brightness of a person who still, despite everything, believed that something good was on its way. Let that be what you carry into the quiet now. Not the failure, which was real, not the grief, which was also real, but the painting itself, the one he made before the friend arrived, in the days of preparation and hope, when the yellow house was new, and the south of France was all light, and the future was still open, and he set up the canvas, and mixed the paint, and began. Because that was what he did, that was all he knew how to do. That was the only answer he ever found to everything the world threw at him. He began. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off,